Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week's show comes to you from Beirut. Much in the news lately as Lebanon strains under the load of 1 million Syrian refugees, a civil war raging next door, and flare-ups at the Israeli border. In the second half of our show, we'll be speaking with Dr. Alain Hakim, Minister of Economy and Trade. But first, it's up to Beit Meri, a town in the hills behind Beirut, first settled by the ancient Phoenicians, to visit with Ghassan Moukheiber, a member of the Lebanese Parliament and Harvard-trained lawyer who has devoted his life to helping Lebanon sort out its complex political affairs. Ghassan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome in Beit Meri.
Ghassan, the world is watching Iraq descend into sectarian civil war. No one knows quite how that's going to work out. Lebanon experienced 15 years of civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people died. It was quite a terrible experience for all concerned. And yet the country came out of it. What lessons can we learn from that?
First, the lesson to your listeners and to every friend that comes to Lebanon trying to understand Lebanon is the following sentence that explains it all. When you think that you understand Lebanon, this means that it was very badly explained to you. When you think you understand Lebanon, this means it was very badly explained to you, means that we are an extremely complex society, and sometimes Americans and others come with overly simplified ideas. And they want to project the image of their political life and their countries into those extremely complex countries that are Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine. And second, you are folks that live in peace, whereas in Lebanon and the whole Middle East is still suffering from a protracted Arab-Israeli war. And that is now coupled with a third dimension that one needs to understand. We don't only live in countries that are made by men or decided by men's thought, but they are moved by God's will through God's writing in Holy Scriptures. And that doesn't only affect your life in the church or in the mosque, but that affects your everyday life. This I call theocracy. And there's a trend, there's a big fight in our countries between secularism and theocracies, between countries that have hegemonical interest, that is, Israel wanting to attack and occupy Lebanon or occupy Palestine or part thereof, and the war that still rages. And on top of all that, the complexities of countries that have never lived in democracy. Especially in Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt. Lebanon is an exception, but it has suffered because it was democratic, in the sense that it was the only country in the area, in the region, that has democratic or quasi-democratic institutions, and therefore it was much more prone to foreign influence and to influences from elements of Lebanese society influenced by the neighbors, the Syrians, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Egyptians, and so on. So we're not talking about a couple quarreling in a house. We're talking about a multi-party or a family that is in a multi-layered feud.
I'd like to follow each of these threads, but take us back to 75 to 90, the Civil War. My wife lived through that as a child and getting her education. She described it as a seven-sided civil war, which is an impossible concept for an American. We had our Civil War. There were two sides. It was devastating to the people in the country, and then it was over. That bears no resemblance to what happens here. Remind us what the Lebanese Civil War was all about.
First, I would contend that it was not only a civil war. That's the first issue, and I was trying to explain it in my first introductory remarks. You say civil war, it's only the parties within a country, such as your American Civil War, having simple two parties. In Lebanon, it was much more complex than that. It was not only civil war because of the Muslims feeling then less represented, having
oppressed.
Fewer authorities, not necessarily oppressed, but they felt that they was underrepresented in the political system. The Christians were controlling the major political institutions, the presidency, the most important administrative positions, a majority in parliament, a majority in the government. Lebanon was perceived as the country of the Christians, and in fact, when Lebanon was established in 1920, then the Christians were a majority. the demographics change over time, but not the constitution and not the way that politics were run. However, and this is a trend that you always see, wherever you have a group of individuals that have identified themselves to a religious group, that is the Sunni Muslims. But at that time, there was no division between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam.
No.
It was mostly the Muslims that were unhappy with their participation. And the new divide in the Middle East is new between the Sunni and the Shia, and one has to go back to this. So at that time, the Muslims felt, the Muslim Lebanese felt underrepresented. But their interest met with the Palestinians' interest that were in Lebanon
mostly in the
in
camps.
great numbers, mostly in camps, but also outside of the camps. They were threatened in their political presence because they were kicked out of Jordan. And third, that met with an Israeli interest to settle the Palestinians definitely in Lebanon, thus having Lebanon replace the Palestine that the Palestinians were hoping to gain on the land of Palestine. So the settlement was an interest of the Israelis that met with the interest of the Palestinians or the Lebanese. On top of all this, you had the hegemonical interests of Syria that never recognized Lebanon's independence and were always considering that Lebanon was carved out of a nation that was an Arab nation.
So you had meddling neighbors.
So necessarily you had those elements I was telling you about. Something that has to do with your internal running of democracy, whether or not you're happy with the system or the power sharing within the political system. Second, you have a war, the Arab-Israeli war, the Palestinian-Israeli war then, and that the presence of the Palestinians and the overall interests of the Israelis to dump the issue over Lebanon.
Over the border.
And say, okay, let's forget it. You want to regain Palestine in Israel, then take Lebanon instead. That's oversimplifying it. And then you've got the hegemonical interests of Syria, always wanting to control Lebanon. And all this in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and not to forget that then there was still the divide between the West and the East, between the socialist East run by Russia, and Russia having mostly the Arabs as their allies, and the Palestinians being supported, and the US protecting the Israelis, and the US trying to promote a different agenda in the world. And Lebanon was that fault line on which the war was raged.
Multiple fault line amongst all the powers.
You always need to understand Lebanon and Lebanese, what you call it civil war. I call the Lebanese wars in the plural, because even within Lebanon, these wars evolved over time. They were not only the same actors,
and they persisted for 15 years
because it's much more complex than one thinks, and it is multi-layered in terms of time, in terms of actors.
And sectarian vendetta.
Not really. Not sectarian vendetta, no. No, that was a sectarian power sharing. There was a frustration of the Muslims being underrepresented and wanting more. And now, after the end of these wars, it is the very same thing in reverse, where the Christians feel frustrated and being underrepresented in the system. And this is why you have the same seeds. However, you don't have the same regional and international dynamics, because the Cold War has ended, or quasi-ended. It's coming back slightly. The Cold War has ended, and there's a new major divide between the Sunni and the Shia that's been promoted in the region. This is the thing that is affecting now.
Let's come to that, but before we do, get to the resolution of the civil war and the current governance structure in Lebanon. Talk about that a little bit.
Lebanon was a democracy in the sense that it is the only country in the Middle East that had elections, parliamentary elections, presidential elections. Any democracy is never a perfect one. However, when others meddle in the way you handle your country, it becomes a mess, and it causes wars when you're into Lebanon. But going back to the settlement, there was a settlement as though three levels. There was a settlement at the local level, that is within the Lebanese power sharing. There was a new agreement for power sharing. It was not 6-5 between Christian and Muslim, as was the case before the end of the war. I would set it historically in the 1990s, on or about the time when the so-called Ta'if agreement was made between the Lebanese and under patronage, regional patronage and international patronage. This is to reflect that it needed those three layers resolved. First, the level of the inter-Lebanese conflict on power sharing, and that was resolved through a constitutional process.
Which is a proportional democracy. Voting power and seats are assigned by religion.
Yes, but with a process that would end these religious apportionment of seats that existed since the very start of Lebanon in the 1920s and in the constitution of 1926. And that was not perceived, but it was meant in the constitution to be only transitory. And the transition has continued ever since Lebanon was established. Lebanon constitutionally strives to be a secular democracy.
That's the goal.
Yes, and that's written in the constitution. This is why you'll see that the tension in Lebanon, which is a minor element that one must take into consideration, is a constitutional framework that is in disconnect with reality. A constitutional framework that strives towards secularism.
But hasn't come close to achieving it yet.
No, and we are now in a state of mounting Islam that is theocratic in the whole region. Not in Lebanon yet. And this is the strength of the Lebanese system. Because we have our democracy that was called in a very complex way by scholars, calling it consociative democracy, consociative from a German word, that applies in complex nations that try to manage unity in diversity, or diversity in unity.
Through power sharing.
Through power sharing in various levels of complexity. The most important decisions requiring a much broader consensus, not necessarily unanimous consent, but sometimes it is getting there. And this is why in the most important decisions in Lebanon, where protracted negotiation takes a long time to get us agree on anything, because those important decisions need to be agreed by all the
you need
elements.
to reach consensus.
Or quasi-consensus. It's not always consensus. So the system in Lebanon works differently than in most countries where it's simple majority that makes a decision. Simple majority can leave out minorities that would feel persecuted because a simple majority was applied. And we're not only the only country in the world that applies this system. You can find it in different ways in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Austria. But they don't have our neighbors.
Yeah, right.
They don't have our neighbors.
Right.
They don't have Israel. They don't have Syria.
So this consociative democracy assigns the presidency to one religion, the prime ministry to another religion. Can you describe that?
Power sharing has always been thus. President of the Republic in Lebanon was a Christian, not always a Christian Maronite, but now it is established by tradition, not by constitution, that the president is a Christian Maronite, that the prime minister is a Muslim Sunni, and the speaker of parliament is a Muslim Shia.
Those are the three major divisions.
Yes, but those divisions don't mean much, because the new constitution didn't grant those individuals much authority. They were granted limited authority, while the executive was devolved to the Council of Ministers. So it's a collegial authority that makes executive decisions, not the president. This is a complete difference from the US system, where you have a presidential democracy, where the president is the holder of the executive office. In Lebanon, the holders of the executive office are 30 people, or 25, as is the case now. That is the Council of Ministers. But mind you, this is taking it over simply because ever since 1990, Lebanon was occupied by Syria, politically and militarily, and partly occupied by Israel in the south. There was not only a power sharing amongst the Lebanese, but the regional power sharing. And Syria twisted the so-called constitutional agreement, called the Ta'if agreement, because it had become the arbiter of all the conflicts. It did not allow...
It was the strong man of the moment.
Exactly. Not only the strong man of the moment, but rather than having an independent Lebanon sovereignly deciding on its interest, it was 100% intervention in every single detail.
Wanted a vassal state.
Very much of a vassal state, and where decision-making lied in Damascus, not in Beirut, and sometimes when decisions were of minor interest, those decisions even were influenced. As an arbiter, Syria could decide through the Lebanese.
Mm-hmm.
That's the genie of the Syrian occupation, is that sometimes it was outright and blunt and seen, and most of the times they were acting through clients. And thus, the importance of the electoral system.
Mm-hmm.
What was happening before the time, before 1920, Lebanon's consultative democracy could only also work because of diversity. There was diversity within each religious community. There were lots of voices representing the Shia, many voices representing the Sunnah, the Maronites, the Orthodox, the Christians.
The Druze.
The Druze. These are the four major groups: Christian, Druze, Sunnah, Shia. But now, and because of horrendously bad electoral systems that were developed through the Syrian hegemony, every religious community now is controlled by one person.
So coalesced.
Yes. So by a much smaller number of parties or individuals, that has turned the once diverse, complex democracy into an oligarchy.
Well, this is happening in the U.S. Congress. That's a separate conversation, but we're seeing that at home. You managed to kick the Syrians out.
Yes, exactly. That has changed.
Which is a watershed.
Yes. In 2005, we did kick the Syrians out, Lebanese, with an international community's support. Because, mind you, Syrian hegemony over Lebanon was agreed by the Americans.
They acquiesced.
They acquiesced, of course, and the world acquiesced to Syrians' control of Lebanon under the guise of, it's too complicated, so let them handle it. And let them also handle Hezbollah.
While they're at it.
And let them handle the complex relationship between Lebanon, that had an open war between Hezbollah and Israel. And Syria pretended then to the world that it was not only the arbiter, yes, but the peacemaker.
That didn't quite work out, did it?
No, because now they fell into the same trap. And now the fault line between Sunni and Shia, the fault line between the West and the East, is in Syria, unfortunately, and that's ongoing.
Let's focus on that as a minute,
war.
Because that is very much in the American mind right now, trying to reinterpret events here in the Middle East. The war between Sunni and Shia historically is hundreds of years old. Maybe it has not been a hot war until recent times, but the division certainly is an ancient one. How do you see it playing out now?
It's been fed. You need foreign interference sometimes to feed such a war. It had never existed in the way it exists now.
You mean feeding foreign fighters, feeding money?
Yes. Feeding it with money,
arms.
Feeding the theocrats with intervention from the Gulf. And
who's doing the feeding? Who's feeding ISIS?
You need to realize that, very frankly, the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, were mostly supported by some sheikdoms in the Gulf, mostly Qatar, were supporting the Muslim Brotherhoods, and the Turks, because Turkey is controlled by a Muslim Brotherhood parliament and Muslim Brotherhood majority in parliament. However, Saudi Arabia is supporting the Salafiyya, the Salafis, that are a sect within those Islamic movements that are both theocratic, because Saudi Arabia is a theocracy. But Saudi Arabia is a theocracy that is based on the Salafiyya model rather than the Ikhwan. To make it simple, the Salafis don't rule by elections. They rule by kingships. It's a royal model. It's a royal model that applies the Sharia, that is the Islamic law. Whereas the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, apply elections. And they are feared by many kings and sheikhs within the Gulf.
Because it's destabilizing.
It could be destabilizing. So you've got these two models of Islam at war. In parallel, and that's within Sunnah.
Within Sunnah, before you even go against the Shia and the Persian Iranian influence.
Because when you go into the Shia dynamics...
so complicated.
But that's why I started telling you what I've said, if you think you understand Lebanon or the Middle East, it was very badly explained to you. So within the Sunnah, you've got these dynamics, and you understand it with what has happened in Egypt.
Yes.
Egypt, all the revolutions, all the Arab revolutions were led by the Sunnah, mostly led by the Sunnah. However, the ones that have run and won the elections were the Muslim Brotherhood.
They were the majority.
They were the majority. But mind you, that majority was not in the interest of the patrons of the others, of the Salafis. And it was dangerous to allow a theocracy based on the Turkish model, even based on the Turkish model, because it ran the risk of destabilizing the Gulf. So what has happened when the US has threatened Egypt, when Egypt rescinded its election and went to put the
army back in charge.
The army back in charge, and when the head of the Muslim Brotherhood was put on trial, the US threatened to pull out all its financial support from Egypt. What happened? The Saudis came back with huge financial support.
Filled the void.
Filled the void. And supported the Salafis against the Ikhwan Muslimin. Now you feel that there is a trend, the reversal of the trend of the Muslim Brotherhood losing ground in Egypt. There's a problem in Libya, in Syria and in Iraq. In Syria and Iraq, the movements that have been now, the so-called Daesh, are the Salafis, are the Salafi movement, not the Ikhwan Muslimin.
So Ghassan, I could...
And there's before one forgets, because Shia is not only a religious matter. It's not people that think or pray differently. They are all Muslims, and they are all theocrats. However, they're linked to a geopolitics that is much more complex, because the Shia are linked to Iran.
Right, which we haven't even talked about.
Yes, and Iran comes in a conflict not only with the Gulf, but with Israel, because it's trying to develop its atomic capacities. So fighting the Shia is indirectly fighting Iran and weakening Iran. And any presence of Iran threatens the Gulf. And sometimes you play on these fights because Israel is happy, rather than...
I want to see their neighbors divided.
Not only divided,
don't want to see their neighbors united.
It's an implosion.
Yeah.
It's an implosion. So if I were in the shoes of the Israelis, this is the best case scenario.
Stand back and let them kill each other.
Exactly. And at least give them a hand whenever you can. Push the weaker to become stronger. When the guy that's stronger becomes too strong, push the other way. And this is what happened in Lebanon.
Yeah.
In Lebanon, there was this attempt to weaken everyone except the Syrians. And that's what allowed the Syrians. That was a game that was played by Syria. Now, the regional game is promoting Israel's interests. Then it was promoting Syria's interests in Lebanon, but it's the same model. Divide to conquer, divide to rule.
So, Ghassan, my mind is boggled. Clearly, trying to export the American model of majoritarian democracy is a hopeless quest in the Middle East. Why does the American government persist in that effort, and is there a better model that could be used?
The model needs to be developed from within the community. And let me tell you that democracy is not only elections, and that's a major problem of international perspectives on elections. I would start with something that's much more evident. Democracy starts with the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individuals that makes up a polity. And those rights are not understood the same way in the Middle East as they are in the US. However, Lebanon is a beacon of hope, because democracy starts with individual citizens. You need to develop citizenship. In most of those other countries, there were no real citizenship, because they were controlled, not only group membership, but dictatorships. Dictatorships kill the individual. And at best, they transform the individual into a client to a state or to a religion. And this is what has happened. Lebanon is probably the only country that has experienced democracy, pluralism, that was not individuality. And where the individual is much stronger than the state. And this is why the Lebanese individually succeed.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. In almost everything they do. They're much better at doing what they do as individuals, but they are failing as a group. A very dear uncle of mine, very old, lived in the US, used to tell me, he was 94, he used to tell me, look, son, a Lebanese is worth 100 American, but 100 Lebanese are worth nothing. They're failing the state construction, and this is the new challenge. We need to rebuild citizenship in Lebanon through respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights, and second, through secular state. The major challenge of the region and in Lebanon is secularism against theocracy.
The first divide.
That's the first major divide, because this kills the individual and puts you in a hegemonic control of your own religion through parties now that are the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Salafis. And this is the difficulty of separating those rules and or models for ruling from regional superpowers that are Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or Iran. Second, yes, Lebanon is becoming a model because in such complex places, giving a voice to minorities, irrespective of how they identify themselves, is at the core of democracy. You cannot run a simple majority, because in countries such as Lebanon or countries such as Iraq and Syria, you have groups that perceive themselves as minorities.
Right.
They feel threatened. The Christians
They have to start thinking of themselves as individuals.
But in the interim, if they feel collectively endangered, then democracy needs to protect the rights of minorities. Democracy is not only the rule of a majority. It's rule of majority plus protection of minority rights.
And perhaps that's the hopeful note we can leave on. Ghassan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Lebanese Member of Parliament Ghassan Moukheiber here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Ahead, we'll be heading down into Beirut to speak with Dr. Alain Hakim, Minister of Economy and Trade, about the Syrian refugee crisis. Stay tuned.